Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about arrays, part 1 in JavaScript. There'll probably be 2 or 3 parts to this because there's a lot of different things we can do with arrays, and they're actually a very important aspect of programming in JavaScript or in any other language for that matter. Alright, so the first thing, arrays in programming are special types of variables. They don't just store one value, they store multiple values in a single variable name, and that's what makes arrays so unique. We can store hundreds of values in an array, and with multi-dimensional arrays we can actually store arrays inside of other arrays, and you'll see that as we work through these lab exercises. Arrays are normally used to store groups of related data. Arrays are very useful when you're not certain how many values the list will contain. When arrays are created, you do not need to specify how many items will be in the array. So we can actually have arrays that are open-ended. I mean, we can actually start out with an array that's got a couple of items, and by the time we're all finished writing our application, it may have hundreds of items that are stored in that actual array. Values in arrays are stored in comma-separated lists, and you'll see that as we go through the lab. And let's look at the typical structure of array. There's a couple of different ways that we can create arrays, and let's look at those as we walk through this presentation. First off, we create a variable called colors. And then the variable creates the variable name. So the variable keyword will create that variable name. Then we're actually going to assign values to colors. And inside square brackets, you notice these are square brackets, not parentheses, we have a comma-separated list. And because these are string values, in other words, they're text, they're actually enclosed in quotation marks. So the values are assigned to the array inside square brackets, and each value is separated by a comma. And again, because these are strings, we actually have them enclosed in quotation marks. They don't have to be strings, and you'll see that as we go through the exercises. We can store any values inside of arrays, and it can be mixed. I can have strings and numbers and booleans all in the same array. And again, as typical with all statements in JavaScript, all the statements end with a semicolon. So the values in the array do not need to be the same data type, so we can store string values, which is what we're demonstrating here with the color values. We can also store numbers, and we can store booleans, and again, all in the same array. And we'll do that when we get in the lab. String values must be enclosed in quotation marks, either single or double quotes. This technique for creating an array is known as the array literal, and this is the way we do it most often. This is how we normally create arrays inside JavaScript. But there is a different way to create arrays called the array constructor, and we're going to look at that next. This is normally the preferred method for creating an array, and that's the array literal. The one we just talked about is the preferred method for creating arrays inside JavaScript. We can also create arrays using what's called the array constructor method. This method uses the new keyword followed by array. The values are then specified in parentheses, not square brackets, and each value is separated by a comma. So they have a little bit in common, but the biggest difference here is that inside the array constructor we use parentheses, we don't use square brackets. And keep in mind, this is not the preferred method. The preferred method is the one we just looked at. We'll demonstrate both, by the way, in the lab. The array constructor method, again, we have a variable called colors, and that equals a new array, and then in parentheses, comma-separated list, I've got the values that make up the array. The var keyword creates the variable name. The new keyword assigns the variable name to a new array, and then the values are assigned to the array inside parentheses, and each value is separated by a comma. And again, because they're strings, they're enclosed in quotation marks. And just like before, the statement ends with a semicolon. The values stored in an array are assessed as if they're in a numbered list. By default, the values in an array are assigned an index number. And again, you'll see this as we go through the lab exercise. It's very important to understand that arrays are based on a zero-based index. That means that the numbering starts with the number 0, not 1. That's probably the hardest thing to get used to when you're dealing with arrays. Now, if you've been around programming for a long time, you're used to zero-based because most everything in programming in binary starts at 0. But again, if you're not, that's probably one of the hardest things to get used to. The first item in an array is not item number 1, it's actually item number 0. And again, we'll have plenty of practice as we go through exercises in the labs, not only in arrays, but as we work through a lot of the other things we'll be doing inside JavaScript, so you get very used to this as we go forward. As an example, the third item in an array would have the index number of 2, and the reason being the first would be 0, the second would be 1, the third would be 2. We'll practice all this in the lab exercises. Don't be concerned if it confuses you, because it confuses everybody when you're first starting out. But again, arrays are zero-based index. Based on the arrays that we build, this is how the index numbering sequence would be displayed. And this is based on the examples that we just looked at. So we'd have an index number of 0 would be green, 1 would be blue, 2 would be white, 3 would be yellow. And that's based on the two examples we looked at as we built those arrays in the presentation. All right, so now let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we talked about inside of our... All right, so let's drop out of our presentation and move into our development environment. First thing I want to do is let's go ahead and confirm that we've got our Apache server up and running. And we do. I'm going to bring up Sublime Text 3 will be my text editor for this demonstration, and Google Chrome will be my browser. I am in my section 2 folder. I actually have the template.html file loaded. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as on this particular template because, again, don't want to overwrite your files. So I'm going to do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as arrays.html because we're actually going to do our first demonstration of arrays. My guess is we're going to have quite a few because there's a lot of things I want you to understand with arrays. And in order to do that, we're going to go through a lot of different exercises in the lab so you've got a great grasp as to how arrays work. First thing I'm going to do, let's go ahead and add a heading inside of our container. I'm just going to put in an H3, arrays in JavaScript. And let's go ahead and close out that H3. I'm going to come right below that and I'm going to create a paragraph tag because I'm actually going to give this paragraph tag an ID. This is where we're actually going to display some of the stuff in our arrays so it's easier for you to see what's going on. I'm just going to give it an ID of colors. And then I'm going to close out the paragraph and then close out the actual paragraph tag because it's going to be empty until we actually populate it with the values in our array. Now I'm going to come down, I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to refresh my browser window, make sure that we're loaded in the arrays.html file. And I'm going to come down right below that paragraph tag and I'm actually going to put in my script tags to start my JavaScript so I can actually start building these arrays. And the first thing I want to do when I do this, let's go ahead and create a variable. And like our demonstration, I'm just going to create a variable called colors and end that with a semicolon. And then I'm going to create the array right below it. So I'm going to type colors. And again, as we talked about inside the presentation, this is the preferred method. The literal method is the preferred method for creating arrays in JavaScript. And actually, in quite a few programming languages, the literal method is the preferred way of doing it. So let's put in our colors. It's green. You'll notice I'm actually enclosing these in quotation marks and separating them with a comma. I've got blue. The next one is going to be white. And the next one is going to be yellow. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. I forgot to put my yellow in quotation marks. It's not going to work that way. And that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type these in. And now the first thing I want to do in our demonstration is let's go ahead and print this array out in my paragraph so you can actually see that, yeah, we do have this array. It is created and it does truly exist. And I can do that by actually outputting the contents of the array into that paragraph tag that we just set up. So I'm going to say document.getElementById. You should be getting pretty used to this one by now. This JavaScript built-in method. And I'm going to say the ID that I'm looking for is colors. And then what I want to do is I want to address the inner HTML. I'm not certain if we've used this one before. I think we have. But the inner HTML method of that particular ID, it actually addresses the contents of that ID. And right now we know there are no contents in that ID. And I'm going to say the contents equal colors. So I'm actually going to give the contents of that paragraph tag all the colors that make up our array. Let's go ahead and save that change. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. And now you'll notice we've got the green, blue, white, and yellow, which we actually entered into our array. In that order, they now make up our paragraph tag inside that paragraph. So we've created our array successfully. We've got 4 values in it. Now we're going to look at a couple things that we can do with that array. One of the first things you're going to be interested in learning once you start working with arrays inside of any programming language, not just JavaScript, is one of the first things you're going to be concerned with is what is the length of the array? And the reason being is a lot of times as we're using loops to go through arrays and pull out data, because that's how we actually work with arrays quite often. We'll actually use loops to go into our arrays and pull out particular data for them. A lot of times we'll need to know what the length of the array is so we know how we can set up the loop so the loop runs effectively. So let me show you how we actually look at the length of an array. I'm going to come down right below that document that we just created. I'm going to create a new variable, and it's going to be called len for length. And I'm going to tell it it's equal to colors.length. Length is a built-in method inside most programming languages that will actually give you the length of an array. Now, in order to print out or to see what that length is, I'm going to use our document.write method inside of JavaScript. And inside my parentheses, I'm going to put in a BR for my break tag. And then I'm just going to type in the length of the array is, I'm going to end that with a colon and a space. Then I'm going to use that concatenation symbol we talked about in an earlier tutorial and type len. So basically what I'm doing is I'm printing text inside the document.write function. I'm saying, okay, print, give me a line break first to go to the next line. I want you to print the length of the array is, put a space, and then find out what the value is in my variable len, which we just created above that. Then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save those changes. You're welcome to pause and type that in. Refresh our browser window, and now we'll see right below our green, blue, white, and yellow, the length of the array is 4. And if we look and count, we actually do have 4 items in that array. So that's working perfectly. One of the other things you're going to want to learn how to do is how to add things to an existing array. And that's a very important feature inside arrays, is being able to add, take away, and sort. We're going to actually talk about all of those as we go through these tutorials. But the push method adds new items to the end of an array and returns the new length. So we can actually use a push method, and we can actually add items to our array at the very end, and then we can get a new length from that, and we'll demonstrate both of those. This method changes the length of the array. Obviously, if we're adding new items to it, it's going to have to change the length of the array, and the new items will always be added at the end of the array. So to add items at the beginning of the array, we can actually use a method called unshift, and we'll actually demonstrate that one also. So now that we've created an array, let's go ahead and add a couple values to it. So I'm going to come right down below where we did that last demonstration. I'm going to say colors, that's the name of our array, dot push, that's the method that we'll be using, and inside parentheses and quotation marks, I'm going to say red. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to come right down below that. I'm actually going to copy the existing line that we have. And right down below that, I want to print out the value of the new array. So actually, I'm going to go in and update that paragraph tag to include the value of the new array. Or what I could do, let's go ahead and do this. That's even better. I'm going to go ahead and copy the existing paragraph. I'm going to come down right below it and say colors 1. I'm going to change this, get element by ID colors 1. So now we're going to actually have both. We'll have the original and we'll have the new paragraph with the new values. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Great time for you to pause and type this in if you need to. I'm going to update my browser window. Now you'll see we have green, blue, white, and yellow for the first one. Green, blue, white, yellow, red for the second one. And now actually let's go pull the length out. We can do that very easily. I'm just going to go ahead and copy these lines, Control C on the PC, Command C on the Mac. I'm going to come right down below our second paragraph that we just created, create a brand new variable, and actually I'm going to leave the name the same, because what we're basically going to do is overwrite the existing length with a brand new variable in length, because it's going to change, and it should tell us that the length is 5 for our second one. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you need to type it in. Let's refresh the browser window. So now we have the first one is 4, then we've got 5. So you can see the length of the array is 5 now as we've added that new item to it. And we can add multiple items to it if we needed to. I just wanted to show you how we demonstrate and do the first one. Now let's move into another example of how we can actually work with our arrays in JavaScript. A lot of things I want to cover in arrays before we move on, but I want to cover one more thing in this section of the tutorial, and that's how we can actually print out the entire contents of an array. I mean, we actually saw how we did this in the paragraphs. It's okay, but it's not how I would normally do it if I really want to find the values of an array. I'd actually use a loop. Now, we haven't learned loops yet, but we're going to. It's probably going to be one of the next areas that we actually cover in JavaScript once we get through arrays. But I want to show you, give you a demonstration of how we can actually go in and see the values inside of an array and print them out where it's a little bit easier to understand what's going on. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come up here to that last length value we wrote because I want to put a line break in there. So I'm going to use my concatenation symbol, then my quotation marks, and I'm going to add a couple of BR tags just so I can give myself some separation between this and the next area that I'm going to print to our screen. So I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Now I do understand that we haven't covered loops yet. I don't expect you to understand the code I'm getting ready to put in here, but it is pretty simple, and I want to show you why it's so important to understand all the different things that we have going on inside our programming, because we're actually going to use one of the values that we just created in this demonstration inside this loop, and we're actually going to use a couple of the operators that we talked about in the earlier tutorials inside this loop. So we're starting to build on that knowledge that you're learning about JavaScript. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's go ahead and put a note in here. This lets me print out the elements of the array. And again, I want this to be in your exercise files so that you have copies of this, and this note will remind you what I actually did with this for loop. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare my for loop, and then inside parentheses, there's three values that we have to have, or three conditions we have to meet inside the for loop. First off, x is equal to 0. And what I'm telling my for loop is this x is going to be my counter, and it's currently at 0. And you'll notice I ended that with a semicolon. And again, you're going to learn all about for loops when we get into the loops tutorials, but just be aware this is how they work. Then I'm saying x is less than len. And there's a couple different ways that we could have done this, but since I've already created this variable right here that tells me what the length of my array is, I could actually use that inside my for loop. Or if I wanted to, I could actually say x is less than colors.length. I could do it either way. I'm going to use the len for the first example so you can see how it works. And then we're going to go back and show you can get the exact same thing by actually using colors.length if you hadn't created a variable to store that length. And again, notice I've ended that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to say x plus plus. And if you remember back from the operators tutorials, operators in JavaScript, I believe it was in part 2, we actually talked about this increment operator where we can actually add 1 to the value of whatever the variable is. And I'm actually adding 1 to x. So I'm saying, okay, x, the first time you go through your 0, I want you to run this code. If you're less than length, run it, add 1 to it. Now you're 1. Are you still less than length? Then add 1 to it. And every time it's less, it's going to run this code right below here. So I'm going to come down right below here and I'm going to say document.write. And then I'm going to say in here, I want you to go get colors. Now we're looking at the actual array and whatever value is in that index number. So I'm taking whatever value x is, that now becomes the colors index number. So I want you to print that to my screen, and then I want you to concatenate a break tag on the end of it. So in other words, give me a line feed with each one that you do. And that with a semicolon. And this is how we use for loops. So I'm actually going into the colors array. I'm using the index number. In other words, whatever the value of x is, I'm going to start out at 0, 1, 2, 3, and as long as x is less than the length, I'm going to print these out. And each time I print one out, I'm going to add 1 to x. And then I'm going to go through it again until x is no longer less than the length. So if I save those changes, I refresh my browser window, now we get a nice printout of all the values that are inside my array. Green, blue, white, yellow, and red. And there it is right there. Green, blue, white, yellow, and we added red to it. So I've got that nice little values to the array. And if I were to add another value to my array, let's say I came in here and said colors push, and let's add another value to the array. And this is the beauty of being able to do this stuff dynamically. I mean, there's so many things that we can do, because now I could add as many colors as I wanted to, and that thing would just continue to run until it ran out of colors. If I added purple, it's going to actually automatically update my list. When I save those changes, refresh my browser window, now I automatically go to 6. I've got 6. I've added purple to that list, and you'll notice it added purple to my list up there also. So I mean, it's programming is really powerful once you start understanding how it all works. And there's a lot of different things that we can do with arrays. We've got much more to cover, but I think this is good for part one because we've probably covered quite a bit. The tutorial's getting kind of long. So I'll see you in part two of arrays in JavaScript. So before I wrap this up and move on, I had forgotten I told you I was going to show you the difference between using the variable length, which is what we created right here, and actually using the colors.length, because it's the exact same thing. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull this out. I'm just going to Control-C on the PC, Command-C on the Mac to copy it. I'm just going to pull out the length variable and actually put in colors.length, so it's actually looking at the array and the length of the array, whether I've created the variable or not. I'm going to save that change, refresh my browser window, and we will get the exact same outcome because the length is still exactly the same. I just haven't created it, or I haven't set it up as a variable right there. I'm actually going into the array itself and looking at the length value of that array. So again, instead of using the variable len, I could actually use the colors.length if I hadn't created a variable to do the same thing in that for loop. I told you at the beginning I was going to show you that it's the same, and I had forgotten before I closed out the tutorial. So anyway, just wanted you to see it, and we're going to get ready to move into part two of the arrays tutorials in JavaScript.